Díagwit agus tá fáilte róta ras chuig riot Sligo. I'm Owen Tomás McDermott agus mar a dúirt mé inné is anar mór domsa a bheith anseo mar éascaitheoir or facilitator na córáite seo agus ag obair agus ag caint lena sanolaithe thar-ceann atá linne. It's a great honor for me to have an opportunity to chat and to discuss and to listen and work with the experts that we have for you today. And you're very welcome back to today's riot. All of our conversations, as you may see on the screen in front of you, are supported by a sign language interpreter. Our conversations are going to be recorded, uploaded to our conference website. And if you would like to play with the layout of your screen, you will find a layout button on the right-hand side of your screen. You can set it to a gallery view or a grid view or a focus view. The focus view is where you will see one of our beautiful faces. So for example, were you to want to use the sign language interpreter, it is thought that the best view for that is in the grid format. Remember, if you are so inclined to tweet, to use the hashtag #RiotSligo, so hashtag #RiotSligo on your social media account. A friend of mine texted me yesterday wondering, had a riot actually started in Sligo, given the level of engagement that we had? So we might want to get that trending again to give everybody else a little bit of a fright. Yesterday, we touched on things like the issues around policy and planning, and the issues around policy and planning around culture and development. The idea as well came up that we shouldn't really ask people what they want or what they need, but rather we should ask them what's important to them. But really that engaging with them is important, and them being kind of everybody, listening to them. We heard about the importance of common practices, the importance of building networks, the importance of doing things, trying things out and being comfortable that they mightn't always work. It was discussed that culture is owned by everybody and therefore everybody is responsible for a culture-driven regeneration. But it was also, the point was raised that somebody taking a lead, whether it's owning the problem, owning the issue, owning the idea, that certainly helps when it becomes somebody's job to drive it on. It became very clear in yesterday's afternoon's conversation that culture shouldn't be commoditized. It shouldn't be. But we also grappled with the economic models, the funding issues that surround culture and development. So all of that was very interesting. All of it has been very instrumental. And our objective for today is really to balance out that conversation. Because if we accept that culture has a value beyond the economic, that culture is something that we all make every minute of every day, then we really have to figure out how can we plan for and how can we manage something that is made by and owned by people in their communities. So our next conversation is going to thrash that out. We're looking at how to develop the resource of culture to the benefit of people, to the benefit of community, to the benefit of economy. And I'm delighted to introduce our contributors today. Natalie Wadick is currently the director of the Irish Architecture Foundation. Natalie has worked for 25 years in the international cultural sector, delivering high-profile art and architecture projects and programs. She was awarded an honorary fellowship for her contribution to architecture by the Royal Institute of British Architects back in 2017. Natalie works with organisations to help them reach their full potential, both in terms of the creative output that they have, but also their greater reach and impact. Helen Marriage is Director of Artichoke, one of the UK's most innovative creative companies. Helen's interests have always centred around the conjunction between art, civic disruption, public engagement, and the transformation of daily life. Back in 2012, she was awarded a prestigious Loeb Fellowship at Harvard in recognition of her ongoing work with urban life. She was awarded an MBE for her services to the arts back in 2016, and she is an area council member for the Arts Council in England, based in London. And as well as that, she was also the creative director for Galway 2020. Mark O'Brien is CEO of Axis Ballymun, at the heart of Ballymun on Dublin's north side of Dublin. As a north side Dubliner myself, I know the great value that Axis Ballymun has and the great work that they do. It is an arts centre, a production company, an arts development organisation and research centre. As well as that, Mark also practices as a theatre director, composer, sound designer, and has also facilitated theatre workshops nationally and internationally. He sits on the board of Kids Own Publishing Partnership. And Mark, may I, on behalf of everybody, also congratulate you on your appointment as Executive Director of the Abbey Theatre. Congratulations. Diarmuid Lawler is an urbanist with a multidisciplinary background. He designs and uses design thinking to unlock problems and describes himself as a principled pragmatist. We might ask you what that actually means, Diarmuid, in a little while. He is Associate Director at Scottish Futures Trust. And Diarmuid has 20 years experience of helping individuals and organisations make well-informed decisions about complex, connected urban policy and investment challenges. Frank Moylan is a local. Frank is a senior planner at Sligo County Council, and he was instrumental in the formulating of the economic development and planning policy for Sligo. This includes overseeing new public space developments in Sligo town centre. And Gillian Nicosaja works with a variety of clients from private to public in the creation of not only high quality, but inviting landscapes for and with her organisation, Fuin Air. Gillian has worked in theatre and has worked in film production and design for many years, and this has given her a rich knowledge of the cultural, social and living history. And central to her mission as a landscape designer is nurturing and the nurturing of streets as places. This morning, our emphasis is really on the process through which culture can be made and culture can be supported. So I'm going to start, folks, with a big question for you all. And Mark, I'm going to go to yourself to kick us off and get the ball rolling. Is the journey toward cultural development and policy, is it inherently exclusive?
Thanks.
That gets the ball rolling, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Yeah, I suppose there's a lot in that question, and I suppose it really depends on what way it's doing it, or what way it's the policy is being driven. I suppose I've been out in Ballymun now for 17 years, and at the time, for the first 10 or 12 years that I was going through the largest urban regeneration project in Europe at the time. And a very wise man who sadly has now passed away, he was a community activist, a local man, local artist, welder, who became very close friends with, had a big beef with the whole idea of the phrase regeneration, because his take on it, which has really sat with me, was how can a community be regenerated when it wasn't generated in the first place? So I think that really stuck with me in the area of the question that you've asked, because I think culture can be perceived and should be perceived as quite a dangerous thing to those maybe in control of policy, because culture is something that really you can't own. Nobody can own it. People can try and control it, and people in power have the means and mechanism to control it. But really, it's about realizing that culture always exists, and it's about our job to amplify it. So I suppose if you're going about policy development or cultural development in its real sense, then it's a very disruptive force. So I think, I throw the question back on you, that it's in relation to how or why you are developing those policies that will kind of predicate whether they're exclusive or not.
And from your experience in Ballymun for almost 2 decades, what have you seen as a key element in making it more inclusive and being successful?
Well, I think certainly as director of the arts centre that sits in the middle of the town, its presence, it's the fact that it's not about it being a project that's been done for 6 months and then is gone. There's a responsibility that this organisation and me and my staff, as people who have been here for quite a long time, have. So it's a kind of continuous engagement rather than being, we're going to deal with culture this year, but then the culture will be fine. Culture is, to me, is continually changing. It's not about, I practice as a theatre director by times as well. And one of the things that was, one of the phrases or definitions that was, we were talking about over a few pints one night, was the whole idea of mushroom directors. And I was kind of going, what to the actor, what does that mean? I was saying, well, that's somebody who leaves people in the dark, fills them full of manure and hopes they grow. So I think that can also be the underlying piece of an awful lot of cultural policy. But when you're here, when you're kind of present and have to deal with the outcomes of your work and take responsibility for it, that's key.
Thank you, Mark. Helen, may I bring you in on that, please? Around that area, around the exclusivity or inclusivity, and from your experience, your view on that around cultural development and the development of policy.
I think Mark's exactly right. The questions are around kind of questions of ownership, not in terms of, you know, who has the money and who doesn't, but who owns the ideas, the instinct for generating activity, all of that stuff. I think Mark's situation in a permanent space in a place brings with it, as he says, those responsibilities to the community, both local and wider. What we tend to do is almost the opposite, which is to reclaim public space that is usually, not exclusively, but usually dedicated to those twin evils of shopping and traffic. And to try and insert a kind of cultural life into places that definitely aim to disrupt people's everyday lives. So that, I suppose my contention is that if you can temporarily transform a physical place, you can forever change how people feel about it, how they feel about the ownership of those spaces, whether the car should predominate in our high streets, all of that stuff. You can force to a sort of catalytic point if you do something of scale, of quality, in collaboration with the community, but not necessarily generated from the ideas of that community. I guess the stuff that we do tends to be generated by artists coming in with a sort of extraordinary broad imagination and then working with people in order that, for however short a time, those familiar spaces are rendered unfamiliar and extraordinary, and that people kind of want to hang on to that idea that a place is malleable, that it's not fixed in terms of its uses or its ownership. And so policy, you know, we're going through a big thing in the UK at the moment. The Arts Council new strategy is called Let's Create, and that is aimed at recognising the creative potential in everybody, 64 million people in the country. And that is one way of approaching it. But I think that any policy that is rigid is necessarily doomed to exclude, you know, some people or others. And therefore, my plea would always be that policymakers are as fluid as the artists and communities that they're supposed to be working for.
Helen, may I, and we may get into this a little later on, but just to go back to something you were talking about of the event and then it having a catalytic effect, but how do you make it sticky so that stays and that hangs on and that positive hangover from the event maintains and stays in a place?
So I'm always,
from your experience of what you've seen.
When we started Artichoke 16 years ago, we started with this incredible piece by Royal Deluxe, the amazing French theatre magicians, I think of them as, who do these huge sagas. And I decided in 1999 to invite them to England, knowing how hard it would be, but not ever knowing that it would take me 7 years to negotiate the permissions, which is what it did take. We eventually did it in 2006. Their response to my invitation was to say no thanks, we know what you English are like, and we know that you are so hidebound by your own rules and regulations, you'll never do the things that we need you to do. They were nearly right, not quite right. And by London saying, why would we do this? No. About a bunch of anarchist Frenchmen taking over our ceremonial streets, why would we do that? So you could look at that journey as a journey that has had profound policy implications for the UK, London particularly, in terms of the public authorities finally, 7 years of negotiation, recognising that what they thought of as events of national significance for which they would willingly close the road, whether that was, you know, something royal, the visit of President Trump, a demonstration, a kind of, you know, there were things that they felt were worthy of occupying those streets, that 7-year negotiation meant that the stickiness of the project is subliminal in a way. It's in the change of attitude by public authorities to the fact that shopping and traffic didn't need to predominate, that it wasn't about national significance in the sense that they understood it, that I wasn't going to go away and do it in a park, which is what they kept asking me to do. So that stickiness exists, but there's real stickiness, and I've always been amazed by this, in the public, those who witnessed it. And 16 years later, people still write to me and say, I remember. My sister rang me last week and said she's reading a book by the British novelist Margaret Drabble. I think it's a sort of biography. And in it is a paragraph about going to see the elephant. I mean, you know, I don't know about the Abbey, but who writes in their biography about going to see Richard III at the RSC? I don't think it sticks. Whereas I think this, not only for Margaret Drabble, but for many people, was a life, and not life-changing, that's too grand a statement, but it really was a transformative experience. And I meet now people who come to work for us who are in their 20s, and they say, my parents took me as a child, I remember it. I mean, there's that sense, as you get with any momentous moment in your own life, you know, when somebody proposes marriage, or you're picked for the school soccer team, or, you know, whatever it might be, there are moments that you think, wow, this is something. And I think that what we try to do is to create those moments, working with artists, in order that a whole community can have that sort of, that memory that sticks with them.
Thank you, Helen. I'll come back to a few of those things, but I would be interested in hearing from Diarmuid. Diarmuid, from your perspective and your experience, is it unfair to say the cultural development and policy can be exclusive and is inherently exclusive?
Well, yes and no. So it absolutely can be designed to be, and then it can absolutely be designed not to be. And I think it brings me back to the discussion yesterday with Arco, and where he talked about there's a lot of enthusiasm around culture, you know, so when we're in it and the creativity, it's really enthusiastic. But he pointed us then to his governance role when he took up a position of politics to try and influence other people who don't have the chat the same as us, who are making decisions about where the road goes and where the infrastructure goes. And it was really interesting that he purposely decided to include voices in the construction of policy, because he saw policy as a foundation of public life. So it's a scaffold of public life. So in that one, there was a deliberate leadership intent to be inclusive, to direct the skeptical around key decisions for public life. But I think you have to be intentional about being inclusive, as opposed to just being, this is the way it was before, this is the way we do it. So we just reproduce old kind of prejudice. And for me, on the substantive issue of policy, regardless of whether it's planning policy or cultural policy or whatever, I think there's a key question of what's it for? What's the policy for, and who writes the policy? And that goes to Mabel's point yesterday. And I guess for me, there's only two reasons you do policy. One is to create a scaffold within which life unfolds, or the second is to manage some things. You know, something's happened in society, but to be given the power to carry forward that policy is not you alone. It must be an inclusive kind of thing.
And Diarmuid, from your analysis or experience, from practical experience, like, what does that look like? What is that?
It looks like an argument. It looks like who are you to go writing this policy? Have you talked to anyone? No. Well, what the hell is it for then? Why is this any good? Oh, this is the last one. I don't give a damn what the last one said. This is a foundation of public life. It's not for you or for me to go off in my bedroom and write this on my own. This is one of the most important expressions of our intent. So it is essential that it's inclusive. So the first bit is an argument, and there will be lots of people saying it's very complicated to include people. Indeed it is. It's very complicated to live in poverty. It'll be very time consuming. It's very time consuming to go down to the post office and get the dough that's not coming to you. So fess up and deal with it. So I think the first part of it is an argument. What is the purpose of this? What is inclusion, and how are we going to set the conditions, not the detail, the conditions for proper policy debates? And I think one of the other issues, just while we're on that, the argument, I think there's also something around when we say the word policy, almost we default to public and government. It's always about public and government. But I'm from Wexford, and the one that used to run the cinema had a policy of not letting us in on a Thursday. You know, so there's kind of there's various different types of policy and pattern that goes on. So I think there's something around the purpose of the policy, but also the ownership of the policy, and a question: why must the policy only be an expression of public policy? Because there are other policies which kind of create a context of culture.
Thank you, Dermot. Frank, I'm going to bring you in on that. You are working in and around policy. You're working in Sligo. When you hear that and hear what's being said, what's your own reaction? But also, what's your own view on that element of the inclusivity or exclusivity of the development?
I suppose only it'd be wrong as a planner who's, we say, developing policy or putting projects together to assume that we know what the public wants. So we're involved in the process of placemaking, and I guess the starting point in the initial design process on any project is listening to what the community that are going to be using that space wants to see in that space. So a broad and inclusive approach will ensure the broadest range of community needs can be met. By encouraging people to participate in the process or designing and reshaping a public place, we can instill a sense of ownership and pride in that environment. But I think it's important to say that the inclusive and collaborative approach is not without its challenges, in that you're not going to keep everybody happy all the time, and often compromises have to be made to allow a project to proceed past the initial design stage. Having said that, the last thing we want is to have to spend, I suppose, scarce public money on a piece of public infrastructure that only one section of the community uses, or that nobody uses at all. So it's essential that we engage and listen to the community in all stages of design process, so to make sure those spaces are successful into the future.
Thanks, Frank. And Gillian, from your perspective as somebody who is again living and working in Sligo, the idea of the taking of the streets, what's your view of that, and when you hear your colleagues discussing that?
A unique opportunity. She's the oh, sorry, excuse me. Have I unmuted myself?
You have, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Sligo has a unique opportunity because it's a relatively enclosed place. You know, it's a small town, so it's very and there's a lot of different community groups and people talking already. Lots of people have lots of ideas, so the community is quite active in individual groups around the streets and around various causes that they have particular interests in, be it tidy towns or disadvantaged areas. There's a lot of work going on in Sligo around that too. But I suppose I would like to see a little bit more of the temporary changes on the streets and basically testing out. So allowing more fluidity in these particular groups getting together and testing their ideas, be it possible edible. I know Edible Bristol did a very great project over there where they have the planting beds in the town don't just have, you know, herbaceous perennials and which are advantageous for biodiversity, of course, but more edible food, so people can get create understanding, or they can basically understand a little bit more about where their food comes from. And sorry, now I'm totally, the nerve got me, sorry.
No problem. And in Bristol and others, is that applicable? Would you see an applicability of that in Sligo, for example, from your perspective, particularly as a horticulturist?
Yeah, I suppose. I suppose yes, the small changes on the streets. I mean, I suppose my real interest in Sligo is creating. It's like reimagining the streets as places, you know. It's a small town, the streets and the footpaths are tiny. I know there's a lot of work being done currently at the moment to make those great changes to the streets. But I would welcome community groups getting in touch and getting together to reimagine how these streets might be used. Maybe I ran a project called the Sligo Parking Day there for a number of years back in the it's about 2015 to 2017 or 18, where we basically, it was where we took over we reclaimed the streets basically for one afternoon in September. It was the third Friday in September, and that was a people-based movement that was started in 2005 in San Francisco, where basically there was an arts collaborative called Rebar, and they started they were exploring how to shake up downtown San Francisco. It was very hot and empty, void of life, really, apart from people just going to work. It was a real thoroughfare, you know. So they wanted to explore how the streets could be bring more life to the streets and make them turn them around into being places. Originally, they're the original placemakers, you know, Rebar. But so they went through lots of workshopping and trying to work out how best to, you know, create small interventions, on-street interventions that could be adopted in the long term. They realized that if the place is covered in cars, you know, there's cars everywhere, so they all have to park somewhere. So there's lots of on-street car parking spaces. So they realized that if they put money, if they put a few dimes into the meter, that they own that particular small piece of on-street property for the allotted amount of time that they put the money in for. So they basically, so they put the money, and it was written into the bylaws that you don't have to park a car there. You own that space for that time. It's written into the bylaws of San Francisco. So they basically, they went back to the workshop, they made a box and put a beautiful evergreen tree into it, and stuck it into a cargo trailer on the back of their bike, and brought it downtown along with some rolled up turf, which isn't cool these days, but they went downtown with that anyway, on a park bench, and they basically put the money into the meter. They overtook this small piece of property for a number of hours, took a few photographs, stuck it up on probably MySpace back in the day in 2005. And it flew around the world, and it gained huge traction. So this one action has just gained so much traction across the world. It grew from one tiny on-street park one day, people reimagined what they might do with it, to a worldwide movement, Parking Day movement. And now I just think that small change that they made, that temporary change, it's turned into a whole, it's really became a worldwide movement into people reclaiming the streets completely. So there's lots of policies been written in places like San Francisco. Yes. It's very popular. Also New York and all around the world. London has some actual parklets where the business owners on the street get together, talk together about what they'd like to extend their usable space. So they basically work with their local authority and get permission to use that space. So I just think that is a very inspirational piece of work that was done as to how a community can come together and make a small change, and it has resulted in policy changes, not just in their own town but across the world. So just the power of creative thinking, designers getting together with people and making change happen themselves. So
brilliant, Gillian. Thank you. Natalie, I'd like to bring yourself in now, if I may. Just again, back to that kind of question, and I'd be very interested, just from your experience and based on your expertise, that element on the development of policy or a cultural development and including people working together rather than that exclusion. What are your views, and what's your reaction to the other 5 speakers so far?
Thanks, Owen. Yeah, I mean, my reaction to the 5 speakers is I absolutely empathize with everybody here and what everybody has been saying. And just to give you some idea of the Irish Architecture Foundation, we always communicate in our mission that we want to grow the desire for architecture, to communicate the cultural value of architecture. So this word culture is really important to us. And actually, in preparing for this conversation today, I got myself into a bit of a fix last night, just going deep into culture and what does it mean and all of these kind of things. And I think it totally wrecked my head. And maybe by the end of this conversation, I'll have calmed down a bit. But anyway, just to get back to my thoughts.
Can I? Sorry, go on. Yeah, excuse me.
Oh yeah. To get back into my thoughts on it and the exclusive nature of it, and connecting to architecture, sometimes thought of as being very exclusive, particularly if we talk about it in terms of finance and money and all of that type of thing. One bugbear of mine, I suppose, is often that, you know, when people review the work that the IF does, you find it in the property section of the newspaper, the throwaway, not in the cultural section. I don't understand that, because the Irish Architecture Foundation doesn't sell houses or buildings. We never have, we never will. Maybe down the line we might have to, I have no idea. But it just doesn't fit with me. And there's a lot of work that we need to do maybe to change that. And we kind of think of architecture more of a kind of a social craft, I suppose, and we need to communicate it in that way. And it's about creating physical frameworks and spaces necessary for bringing people together. But just going back to, if I can share with you some of my thoughts on my definition of culture. And culture, you say, like, is it inherently exclusive, inherently complex? And so is the idea of community, as Gillian was just talking about. And I was thinking about Sligo, and I was thinking about any town outside of Dublin has a growing multicultural community, and this I see as an asset and an opportunity, you know, in terms of redefining that culture of Sligo, and by bringing in all the various different communities, the new and established. To do that, by doing that, you're revealing and bringing to awareness the diverse cultures that exist there. But when I think about community, it is as complex as culture. In the IF, we always define it in two ways. One is a community of place, which we all know is, you know, geography, location, where you live, work and play, that type of thing. But also crucially, community of interest is, you know, a lot of our work specifically works with communities who have some shared interest or passion. For example, over a period of 4 years, we worked with the Ballyfermouth Youth Services to build a skate park. Now, that was a community of interest. That was a group of young people who really wanted this skate park, but it wasn't, and it goes back to the conversation yesterday, it wasn't they needed and wanted that, but then we started talking to them about values, and they created more than a skate park. They created an outdoor sports arena as a space for the whole community to engage and enjoy. And not only that, they want people from all over Ireland to come to this space. So, and other examples, we worked with active age groups in Dún Laoghaire as well we worked with them with a collective in London called The Decorators, and an artist in Dublin. And that was to insert older communities into the DLR development plan or policy, to insert their voice. So it's a bit more complex than just saying cultures. You know, there are different types of cultures, as well as there have been different types of communities. When I think of culture, I think of intangible culture as much as I think about the tangible cultures. Intangible culture doesn't belong to, or intangible culture doesn't belong to anybody. That's language, folklore, etc. Ownership doesn't really come into that conversation at all, but it is crucially important. I know that the Heritage Week this year is going to explore intangible heritage. You know, we're used to it exploring the tangible heritage, the buildings, etc. Now it's going to explore intangible heritage as well, which is fantastic. And of course, my God, that's really exciting for all of us. And we often talk about just the tangible cultures, the arts, the festivals, the artifacts, the books, the objects, the buildings, the monuments, and even the landscapes. Actually, that's a tangible part of our culture. So all I've done here is just probably complicated it, but I can bring it back to just the basics just for 1 second, and this will be a second. And I just want to quote one of the most quotable architects and sort of influencers, Jan Gale, when he said the common factor for me, and the common factor always is we bring it back to the essentials, which is always in terms of people first. And he always says, better get this right now live, first comes life, then Okay, life, then spaces, then buildings. The other way around never works. Yeah, thank you.
Life, space, buildings,
but
the other way around doesn't work.
it
Superb.
doesn't work, never works, yeah.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Helen, I'd like to bring you in because I suppose there's cynics, maybe there is a cynic in me, when we look at the discussion around culture and cultural development, that you could argue is, sure, it's all for tourism. It's heads on beds, it's getting the tourists in. That's the real motivation for doing this type of stuff. I'll put that to you.
Not my motivation.
Develop on that, but is that a sense? So say, for example, that whether it's Sligo or Galway or Durham or London or wherever, is it really, when you boil it down, it's to have people come and visit?
Well, how to explain? Every event that we've ever done, we've commissioned independent evaluators who come in and measure stuff. So they measure, you would expect them to measure economic benefit, numbers of bed nights, distances traveled, proportion of people coming from outside the region, international visits. They do all that stuff. But we also get them to measure all kinds of other things like happiness, pride, sense of community, sense of belonging, and those elements. And we do a lot of sort of vox pops and case studies. And for me, the anecdotal is as important as the sort of metrical in terms of how you're valuing something. So I was once at a conference in America, and somebody said, I was wittering on about something, telling some story, and the guy running the conference said, Helen, the plural of anecdote is not data. And I said, oh, but it is. Oh, but it is. And actually it is. Most of the value in Artichoke's archive is about people's stories, about their experience, either of being part of an event, creating the event, witnessing the event. And while the instinct of funding bodies and others, tourist boards, others, may be to take the tangential benefits of an event happening and value those above anything else, I think for the people who originate the ideas, the artists who work on it, the communities who are involved, those are byproducts. They're great byproducts, don't get me wrong. But the main impetus is the creation of the work, is the effort and the work that goes into making something remarkable and extraordinary. And I think the two sit side by side. I suppose what I would also say is that I'm never comfortable with denying anyone's experience. So if you're a visitor from London to Galway, I'm as interested in you as I am somebody who lives in Clifton or Gort or somewhere, or Galway itself, coming. Also, I think people are people. The fact that we choose to measure some people and value their financial contribution over others is a failure of public policy, I would say, because I think that cultural value, we have to find new ways to measure that.
And Helen, is the reason why they go with the more economic way of assessing it is because it's easier?
It's certainly easier, but it's also that in our heads we value so I could do a little experiment. I've done this before. So here we are. I don't know how many people, 10 people, one invisible, so 9 people. Okay, hands up if you've ever been in love. Hands up if you've ever had a relationship. Hands up if you've had a long-term relationship rather than a one-night stand. Hands up if you've had a heterosexual relationship. Hands up if you've had a gay relationship. Hands up if you've had children. Hands up, all of those things. We can measure all of those things. We can count all of those things. And then if I say to you, but what does it feel like being in love? That's not something that you can measure or count in that same way, but it is the important thing. What it feels like is the important thing. And that's the thing that we have no way of measuring when we're talking about an art event or, a theatre play or a poem that's moved somebody or lyrics of a song. We find it hard to measure emotion. We're really good at counting. And I think that it would be great to try and work There is a new institute in Warwick over here in England, which is called the Institute of Cultural Value, and they are trying to determine new ways of assessing the impact of culture, because we as a nation here, I don't know about over in Ireland, don't think that saying it was great, people liked it is enough.
I'll come back to that. Many of the things you said there, Helen, that was fantastic. And Natalie, may I bring you in? You wanted to pop in on that?
Yeah, just I just wanted to pop in on your tourism question, Owen, as well. And I too, it's not something that directly relates to the work of the IIF. However, it is something that is a very direct connection to the outcome of the work that, say, we do or groups like us do in the built environment, because it is a fact that, and I truly believe that if a city works for its inhabitants, you know, if it is well designed, if it contains life, if it's aesthetically pleasing, if it has cultural spaces and activities and all of these things, nighttime and daytime activities, great infrastructure, green spaces, you know, a successful public realm, and crucially that people live there, it will be attractive to tourists without having to add on, you know, appendages or additional things to attract them in. And I think that a sustainable city that is just designed, say, for tourists or office workers is not a sustainable city. I mean, I think that the pandemic has proved that, has proved that point. So just, I mean, we don't directly deal with it, but it is an output of what we do. And I just want to say I'm grateful to see people like Fáilte Ireland putting funds out there for animation of public spaces in local authorities and stuff like that, because I know that it is about tourism. Fáilte Ireland is about tourism, but they're genuinely wanting these places to be improved for locals first, tourists second, you know. So that was just my point on tourism, because there is a link.
Yes. Thank you, Natalie. Dermot, may I bring you in? There's a question that I have. Community, if we were to do a kind of a word cloud or whatever that term is, of the most commonly used word in this conversation, community would have cropped up. Some would say, though, there are more pressing issues for communities than culture. There's hospitals, there are roads, there are schools, there's employment. Why should we not look after them and let culture look after itself?
You could do, yeah. So you could take that kind of position, but I think if you unpack the word community or gathering or a collective or whatever, at the heart of it is some kind of common intent to sustain each other. So why do communities form? Because they've got something in common, and working in common means that we can support each other. It's not that dissimilar to the definition of an economy. So to have a successful economy, you arguably need successful communities. So that's all good, right? But then land that to your point about stickiness. I live in Edinburgh. I don't live in Wexford. I left. And I'm pretty sure that there's lots of people at the time I was leaving Wexford in Sligo thinking, I'm off. I'm leaving this town. It's been good, but I'm off. It's nice that they're fixing the potholes. It's nice that they're building the hospitals. It's nice that they're building the bridges, but it no longer speaks to me, and it no longer engages me, and it no longer validates me, and it doesn't recognize me, and it doesn't support me, and I can't see me here. So I suppose if people are at the heart of the community and community is at the heart of the economy, then you could say, well, maybe one of the things that creates stickiness is a reason to stick around. And one of the reasons to stick around is people like us, or spaces that I can be part of that gives me the space to be myself. So I think you can't have infrastructure without people. You can't have people without acknowledging that the spaces we create for people to be themselves are not just the physical ones, they're the relational ones. And in small towns in particular, I think a key space that's important is a safe space to be different. So you don't have to go playing football. You don't have to go playing hurling. You don't have to go just drinking down the whatever it might be. You can be you, and that's totally okay. So culture, I think, creates a space for people to be. You don't have that, you don't have community. You don't have community, you don't have the workforce. You don't have the workforce, the bridge doesn't work.
Mark, can I bring you in? Because again, on that community word, not necessarily on the same line of thinking that Dermot had there, but is even the word community at times a little dangerous? Is there a danger in the use of it? Because really what we can be talking about are many different communities living in a place, for example. And how that term, how do you navigate that?
Well, yeah, there's a few things I'd like to respond to there, actually, because I think the phraseology, even in this conversation, has become tricky. We kind of we try and avoid to use the word community, because certainly within the art space, community for many years is only recovering from the trauma of being a dirty word in relation to being less than or an adjunct to. But I suppose I'm very much taken underneath all that by the whole idea of the word culture, because it's a slippery slope from moving from the word culture to arts practice or heritage. Now, I feel there's a more fundamental issue around culture and cultural policy. I really liked what Dermot said there about seeing yourself reflected, or I can't see me here. And I think that is a major part of placemaking, both in a liminal space and also within a kind of geographical space of people seeing themselves reflected. You know, the horrendous thing of generations of families living in an area, but the area doesn't reflect their lived experience, which happens an awful lot of time. For me, then, this brings up the whole area of kind of class, of ethnicity, of disability. And for me, culture is like a pressure cooker, where the pressure cooker, the structure of the pressure cooker is our society and our policies and our government. And the culture is what's happening inside there. So, you know, sometimes people look at kind of social unrest or crime or, as a problem with culture. But that is the culture caused by the situation that people exist in. So putting in an art center is not going to solve that. And I think, and an awful lot of the time, it becomes a virtual panacea. Well, then why aren't people getting involved in the art center? Well, because it's generational of poverty. People can't see beyond the end of the week. So what we have kind of come to in our thinking in relation to the way Access is kind of practiced within and with our community is, like, we don't use the word outreach because of the kind of, for me, that's a very colonial kind of word in relation to master and, knowledge based. We don't use the word community, we use the word people. But also we actually posit the argument that our belief, and my personal belief, is that humanity is intrinsically and naturally inclusive. That's what we do naturally. So being exclusive is actually a construct, and that's something that we do on purpose in order to maintain something. So I think it's about flipping the argument and kind of going where the natural thing is to include people, and it's actually only when you look at it that way that actually, well, why are people behaving like that? Well, it's a paradigm for control, or it's a paradigm for the status quo. And just to finish, I think as well that culture can be very simply adapted. It's like kind of, putting food dye in kind of clear water. If you announce that there's going to be a culture of collaboration within your organization, then therefore there is. Then you have to make it happen. So it's not necessarily about the output. It's about you saying there's going to be something done. And one thing that we've learned hugely here is, and the bigger argument for me, or the big sort of lifelong question for me is it better to ask people their opinion when you have no intention of doing anything about it, than actually not asking them at all? And I still haven't figured that one out.
Presumably, if you do nothing at all, it then therefore makes them feel that their opinion was not any good.
Well, yeah, but I kind of double down on that. It's like, it's not about kind of asking people to kind of come with your ideas and they're going to all happen, but it's actually the fundamental thing of listening to somebody. So it's actually engaging in a real conversation, kind of going, yeah, that's interesting, but, or yeah, we'll do something about that. But by and large, when people are being consulted or are being, and this is in the arts sector, this is all over society. This is a cultural thing rather than a cultural sector thing.
Brilliant. I'll come back to a few of those, because what popped into my head, Jeremy, was the conversation you and I had a little while ago around consultation, and how consultation can be false or can be almost a facade. And that they can be also draining for everybody involved in it. Can you build on maybe what Mark was talking about there from your own experience around that aspect, please?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, Mark. And I think the a version of the same point is, don't ask somebody a question if you're not interested in the answer. And a lot of time we seem to fragment what are important integrated social questions into small bits and pieces. So my mother has got vascular dementia. You know, there'll be a leaflet, come and talk about such and such, and then there'll be come and talk about the such and such. So how does a citizen make a decision which conversation on such and such is the useful discussion to be part of? Where's my voice in it, and whatnot? I suppose. So I understand from the policy and public investment point of view, there are certain key gateway decision points at which we need assurance that this is the right thing to do. And that's why we've set structures up. But that's only one moment of one project of one part of life. I think that the different bit, to go back to Mark's bit, is it's more difficult to have ongoing conversation with people. You know, it's not more difficult, but we have to organize differently to have ongoing conversation where people feel welcome to come in and talk about nothing at all, so that the practice of meeting people is established. So on the day you do need something, you can call in and the other person doesn't even have to ask, you see it. So I think we need to separate out two bits here. One is that there are investment and project-based conversations which have some gateway moments, whether it is arts program, infrastructure, or whatnot. But that's not the same as a conversation within groups and settings and places, which could be curated much different, more effective, more sustainable.
And Dermot, then to jump in saying that's all, you know, well and good, and isn't that a very nice thing to say? Where have you seen that work?
Well, I mean, I think Access in Ballymun, or some of the work that Natalie's been doing, are really good examples of the attempt to try and connect conversations, but also to root it into some of the issues that are relevant to people's lives. You know, so let's not talk about something that's not relevant. Let's construct it relevant. On a cultural point of view, one of the examples that I saw that I really liked was in Dundee. As part of the bid for the capital of culture, they created a platform called We Dundee, where they asked people what matters to you in the city, and they went out and they visited old fellas and queer fellas and young fellas and all sorts of stuff, and they just asked them, and they had picture frames in the middle of the city. They had conversations in old people's groups, so they went to where the people were. And for me, that was one really important bit. It's, you took the trouble to come and see me. But that's a key part of a conversation. You took the trouble to come to see me. Then you listened to me, you know, rabbiting on and whatnot, and then engaged into kind of a different thing. And then they crowdsourced all of that opinion to construct the bid. So that gave, I think, three things. One is an expression of what this city is after. Number two, it starts to construct collective leadership at micro and macro levels. You know, people say, yeah, I'm into that. And I think the third bit that it did is to create a legacy beyond the bid, because the bid wasn't successful, but a series of things beyond it were. So I think that bit about you took the trouble to come and see me is the nub of it. And that actually goes back to yesterday's conversation about what are Ireland good at? They're good at conversation. What's conversation about? It's about taking the trouble to talk. That's it.
And also Ario's point of asking people what's important to them rather than necessarily what they need or what they want. Frank, can I bring you in on that, please, from your perspective of being in Sligo? and that element of participation, that listening, that collaboration, and who is participating in the planning around that. Can you describe that for me and what your reaction to what we're hearing is, please?
Well, I suppose in terms of preparing or proposing planning policy or projects, there's a very formal public participation process involved in that, set out under planning legislation. So whether it's in the context of a development plan, we have to go through a series of public consultation stages, or whether it's in the context of a master plan, we'll say, for the town centre, or in the preparation of a public realm plan, which we've recently done. There are a series of public consultation processes we have to go through. And ultimately, it's the elected members, in other words, the officials or the councillors who are elected by the public, who are the ultimate decision maker on whether or not those policies or those master plans are adopted. Now, I would accept that sometimes local authorities in the past have paid lip service to genuine consultation. In other words, they look at it as a box ticking exercise. In other words, this is something we have to get through, and then we go ahead and design the policy or the project. Whereas I think in recent times, there's an acceptance that we have to involve ourselves in genuine consultation. And certainly we've learned that on a lot of our projects around the town centre. If you want them to be successful, if you want them to be used by the public, you have to ensure that you've listened to the people who are going to use those spaces or take advantage of those spaces during the consultation process.
Thanks, Frank. Gillian, from your own perspective then, as somebody living, working and creating in Sligo, what's your reaction to the conversation so far? What's your view?
Participation is obviously extremely valuable opportunity for communities and people to get together and work out what it is that they find important and what they want to work towards. But I think it's invaluable for community groups and people to gather together at first, just to try and just have the conversations around the kitchen table for starters, and with their friends and their families about those issues and what's up on the top of their list, what's on the bottom, and then to reach out to the creatives within the community. So you'd have your designers and your creative facilitators, so they will come along and be the architects or other designers within the community who will help them design workshops and sort of distill down what it is that's important, and at that point then to open it up to formal public participation within a more formal setting. But I think to give them just to encourage the community to have the conversations together themselves to work out what's important first. Yeah, and that's it really. I suppose something Mabel had touched on yesterday was that a lot of various factions of the community or different groups of people on the margins may not feel like they have a voice. So it is important for them to get together first and then bring it to the next level and the next level, and then hopefully within the public participation that they have a distilled idea and they can move it forward within a more formal setting.
Good morning, Gillian. Thank you. I'd like to go to Helen, if I may. Helen, I'm not telling you what to talk about, but I'm fascinated by the great work you did around the Lumiere Festival. So forgive me if I'm pointing you to talk about that. But in particular, that I'm interested in creative interventions in public spaces that involve the wider community, not just the artists, and the type of engagement that's required around that, what it looks like, the types of costs. How do you go about approaching that? Because what happened in Durham seemed to address many of those things.
So Durham, for anyone who doesn't know, is a city in the northeast of England, just a few minutes south of Newcastle, much bigger city, 12 minutes up the train line. And we have been working there for 11 years, creating every 2 years a biennial festival that takes over public space in a really remarkable way. And we do it hand in glove with all the sort of principal stakeholders, but also the community, without whom, you know, were people not to like it, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. Because we close all the roads, we close the roads to pedestrians because there are too many of them, and we basically transform Durham, which is a very ancient place, on a peninsula, so it's an island, practically an island, into a giant outdoor art gallery for 4 nights every 2 years. So it's for a very brief period, but before it happens, in the year before it happens and leading away from it, we're embedded in the community doing work out in the county. So the county divides into 2 very economically different areas. So the east of the county is the sort of deindustrialized place of mining, shipbuilding and steelworks, none of which exist anymore. And the west of the county is leafy dales and beautiful things, but still with quite a lot of rural poverty that's invisible in the prettiness of the whole thing. So we're working in communities, groups, people, towns, villages, schools, all of that kind of stuff throughout the year. And then for these 4 sort of extraordinary nights, we install the work that has resulted from all of that community activity, and alongside the work of internationally renowned artists on an equivalent platform. So you, unless you looked it up, wouldn't be able to tell whether it's Tracy Emin or Jenny Holzer or made by somebody locally. We invest a huge amount of money in the production values of everything that we make, so it's all produced to the same standard. And then the public is invited, it's free, to wander the streets and take in these. So for some people, it really is just that sort of flash, I'm tempted to say light at the end of the tunnel in these COVID times. It's this extraordinary moment where you get to walk the streets and marvel at the transformation of a familiar landscape by the imagination of artists, both professional and committed people locally. For others, it's a showcase of their work, of their effort, the stuff that's gone on to it, and it takes a very long time to put together. And the people, you know, I talked at the beginning about London and how negotiating for 7 years over the Sultan's elephant produced a change in policy. In Durham, it's really incredible. And I was struck only last week by the Pathways officer of Durham County Council writing to me. So it was February when he wrote, so not last week, last month. And it was a great long report. I couldn't work out why I'd been sent it. And then I realised that what it was discussing was the fact that the path, the Riverside Pathway, which is owned by the cathedral, maintained by the council, was collapsing. This is in February. And he was basically writing to say to me, this will affect you. We don't do it till November. But he was basically saying it's unlikely that the wheels that grind that will make this, will mend this, will grind quickly enough for you. And I thought it's really interesting that the Pathways officer of the county council is thinking about the impact of something that will happen in 6-9 months' time. And so we've been involved in all the discussions with those stakeholders about how to make it get fixed quicker, because without that pathway, I can't move the audience. So the scale of it, the city itself is about 45,000 people. There's a big university there. The wider county probably has another 400,000 people in it. But we get 250,000 people coming over those 4 days. So it's a massive influx of people into a very tiny space. And without the active cooperation of the people who live there and work there and who are the agencies that work there also, we wouldn't be able to do it. So it is like a whole community effort to transform those spaces. And I would be lying if I didn't say that there isn't the odd lingerie shop or bar that's slightly off the beaten track, or, you know, taxi drivers, my bête noire, who kind of hate it because it is so disruptive, because the roads are all shut. You can't get into the city centre unless you've got one of our free tickets between the peak hours. We give away 80,000 free tickets. You can easily get them, but without it, just so that we can control the numbers. But it's a massive logistical exercise, and it has to be willingly done. I can be waiting for everyone to go, nah, actually enough. We've done this for 10 years, stop. But even now, with the serious lockdown situation that we're all in, the response we're getting both from the agencies and from the public is can't wait. It's going to be a return to something that we look forward to. It's a kind of punctuation point, and it is literally the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, the chief executive of Durham County Council sent me a text this morning to show me that last night is the anniversary of lockdown in Britain. Yesterday, that they lit the whole of County Hall with a massive rainbow. It's the most incredible picture. And he sent it to me and said, looking forward to better things in the future. But just to show that the way that we've worked there over the years has really encouraged people to go, you know, this is something that we can all do and we're proud of and we want to make happen. And it costs, yeah, it costs a fortune.
Yeah.
It costs a fortune. We never charge. I occasionally think, I try and persuade the council with whom we work very closely. I go, can we charge for car parking? Because we park everyone on the outskirts and bus them in. And they go, no, it should be free. And then I go, can we charge on the buses, please? Can I just get, if I got £1 for every of the 250,000 people who come, that would be such a help with the budget. And they just go, no. So we don't charge for anything.
Okay. Thank you, Helen. Can I remind the people watching in that the chat function is open and the Q&A function is going to be opening up in about 10 minutes time, and it's on the right-hand corner of your screen. Natalie, may I go to yourself, please? There has been a lot of talk over the last 2 days around the whole area of the built environment as being part of culture, for example. But how do you reconcile the fact that the majority of people have really very little say, if anything, in relation to how the built environment looks?
Thanks, Owen. Yeah. Sorry, excuse me, just getting more comfortable settling into this question. Yeah, no, it is a very important, very vital question. And I just want to also, just before we discuss the built environment, which is slightly different to, say, architecture, the built environment encompasses a lot of other things, where architecture is definitely confirmed has been part of culture and an art form identified by the Arts Council in 2005, etc. So it is an extremely important part of our culture if we define our cultures, our development of our art forms. But the connection to the idea, the fact that the majority of people say they don't have a say in their built environment, that's something that the IF, I suppose, as people have called us, I don't call us this, but people have called us kind of like an independent broker between, say, the art form of architecture and the people who make policy, and we create sort of frameworks to sort of bring those people together, and that's really what we do, and we do it in many different ways. And the IF is 15 years old. It's, I suppose, only 15 years old. And when it was first set up, it was set up by a consortium of like-minded people who realised there was no public-facing organisation in Ireland to deal with the built environment and architecture's role in that, etc., and bringing people into an awareness of architecture, because, as you said, it's absolutely everywhere. But there is this distance and this sort of separation. And at that time when the IF was set up, there were 22 organisations in the UK doing a similar thing. I worked in the Architecture Foundation in London, so I came over to Ireland to take on this job. But we started by just raising awareness about architecture and using festivals like Open House to raise awareness, and that was crucially important, by the way. It is important to sort of build up that audience, because people are saying, I never really knew about my city. I really didn't know why these buildings were put there. I don't, you know, all of these things, which is completely and absolutely understandable. And by sort of engaging in Open House, you know, they may get an appreciation about how cities come together. They are complex things. Say, for instance, just for example, Bucyrus, right? Bucyrus was built in the 50s. People either love it or hate it. It's just one of those things, right? And so over the time, say over the past 14 or so years, we've taken thousands of people into Busaras, right? Thousands of people, and some people come out and they still dislike it. That's absolutely fine. Other people go, oh my God, I didn't know. Busaras is an absolute prime example of a building that was created at a time where I suppose architecture's culture was extremely something that policymakers were actually aware of. By commissioning, say, Scott Tan Walker to design this building, every part of that building is designed and crafted. It's a collaboration between art, architecture, etc. They made a building with a cinema in the basement, and it was supposed to be a ballroom at the top. It was a bus station. So it really sort of described this kind of brave new world of modernism. You know what I mean? It was something that Ireland needed to do to identify with an internationalism of a style and design. And so when you tell people all of this story, they go, "Oh right, okay, that's really interesting to me." And the feedback we get from projects like that is like, I really didn't. You made me fall in love with Dublin again, or stuff, things like that, which really, you know, pleases us greatly. So we just continue to do that. But there was a point in the development of what we were doing that we actually felt that, okay, we created an audience of sorts, and we're looking into now how we can actually really dig down and figure out who we are speaking to and who we are crucially not speaking to is very important. And that's our action currently at the moment. But we also wanted to actually work directly with communities on changing, working with them on actually physically changing the built environment, and in connection to what their needs are, or what they value in that built environment. And the Ballyfermot project is the case in point. You know, that was a long-term project. We we worked with various different communities there. I think we met on like literally one-to-one workshops. There was about 2,000 people, and then we did lots of other things as well, more sort of larger groups, conversations and stuff like that, but directly working with various different groups of people to build that park. And I think that if we're talking about impact, and I think about it as afterglow, the impact, okay, the park is successful. That's fine, that's great. I'm very happy about that. But what was the most amazing thing I heard, which about that park afterwards, after the IF left, right? So we've left there. We just kind of connect in with them now and again to see how they're going. Was that the Ballyfermot Youth Group, beside the play park, there's this changing rooms that that are actually mostly shut down, that they use for the football pitches. It's just a very, very, very unattractive breeze block building. So they've decided, the community decided themselves to, now that they've got this park, to turn that building themselves. We're no longer there. We're not part of this. They just tell us this into a bike repair shop and etc. stuff like that. So that is what, if we're measuring success, or that's an afterglow effect, which I'm not there to walk them through that. That is what they have continued on. The legacy, I think Dermot might have been talking about that as well. And there are other projects like our Architects in Schools project, where actually the co-design projects that they work with with the students, that the architects work with the students, we're meant to work with, go in there for 12 weeks and then leave, etc. But there was one school, Stanhope Street Stanhope Girls' School in Stoneybatter. They decided to actually generate income to actually change, to make that design become a reality, and to redesign the interior of their hall and stuff like that. So there are things that we kind of set them up, and then they flourish themselves naturally. And so with the combination of that, and your question was like, people have no say. People have, there are ways that people can have more say, and people are genuinely becoming, forming themselves into groups that they want to be more activistic about this. And I'm very optimistic. I mean, there's a growing resurgence of town teams around the country. We work with them with our project Reimagine. Currently, we're delivering projects across 6 towns, and 4 more to come on board in a project that's called Reimagine. There's also the tidy towns. The tidy towns are now using the RII toolkit, and they're now engaging with designers. So that's moved. I mean, the tidy towns group are now thinking about climate change and recycling and design. It's not just hanging baskets anymore. I mean, this is development that makes me very, very excited. So people are having more of a say, whether they are going to initiatives that are very much about, you know, engaging people in the stories behind buildings and stuff like that. So they're becoming more informed, so they become more thoughtful stewards of the environment, so they can challenge people who are, you know, the people who are in policy and in charge of the built environment, but also people are involving themselves in more creations. You've got the self-organized architecture as well. They're working with what are the community land trusts to work on housing as opposed to, these things are happening around the country all the time. It's important that we talk about them more.
Can I jump in then? When you think about if you were advising somebody listening from Sligo, is it saying you have to have an organization, you must engage with the public, you have to have an idea? If you were to give it in a nutshell, what would it be for somebody in Sligo?
I think that community groups, there are community groups in Sligo, they are already there, and they are genuinely passionate about their built environment, their town, etc. The idea of reimagining Sligo is something that is actually a very powerful thing to do. It's important, I believe, to reimagine places because places change. They may have once suited a particular type of community that's lived there, but nowadays contemporary life, things move on and change. Communities are forming, they are there. What they can do is that they can first of all, they can talk to us in the Irish Architecture Foundation and engage with our Reimagine programme, and we can give them some advice and talk to them about talking to them about various different ways to get their ideas into the next stage and maybe engage with an architect. But more often than not, just working together and being a community that genuinely wants to, and they do exist. They do exist, and there are a lot of organisations out there that are dealing with this. And just to be made aware of that and to connect with people like us in the IF and others. I mean, there's a whole host of them, and it is a very positive movement that is happening out there. I can feel it, and I'm really excited by it. But also just making people aware of their town. And I mean, sometimes it starts with awareness and conversations, you know, and like this conversation. But I mean, that would be my advice to people in Sligo.
Thank you.
We're already doing great stuff anyway, so you know, it's the next step is easier.
Thanks, Natalie. Mark, can I go to yourself, because there has been something in my head since Frank said it, and I wanted it addressed, which was around the area of kind of public officials or local government paying lip service to this. And I'd be interested just from your perspective around how local authorities, how local governments, how residents can work together, where the parameters of that, and how do you ultimately end up to it being a success, and where does the leadership come from?
It's kind of, to me, it's a quite simple beginning to what can become a complex thing. It's an understanding that people are in those organizations as well, that those public officials are actually people, you know, that they have roles, but they also have interests and likes. I mean, I remember talking to a senior public official in City Council once, and his opening gambit was, I don't know anything about the arts, if, you know, I just don't, you know. And then proceeded to tell me over an hour and a half conversation how he used to write poetry when he was 10. So there's a fear, there's a great fear in a lot of public officialdom around the anarchy of the arts, or Jesus, those mad people are going to come in here now and waste a huge amount of money and it's going to be mad. But actually there's an excitement around the possibility of the way the arts or culture can engage with the public that sometimes the local authority can't. I mean, I remember, like, we talked about community groups. When I started in Ballymun, my first job here was to engage access with the local community. And at that stage, there was 125 community groups in the area. So my first 6 months was going out and meeting them all. That was my job. And you could nearly map out the conversation like each time. The first part was like, what do you want, in a quite forceful way. The second question was, are you from the local authority, in a quite forceful way. The third question was, have you got any money? And when I answered like no or I'm not sure to all those questions, then the kettle went on. And I think an awful lot of it is about having the confidence to stand there. And I think where sometimes there's this, I think there's a mediation role sometimes it needs to happen between the level of expertise that is in the local authority of the fact that those people have got their job based upon qualifications and experience, but also because sometimes they're the people who've been in certain communities for longer than some of the residents that are actually living there. So there's a deep understanding. And I think the more that's negated, the more this false dichotomy comes into play of, you know, the people versus the local authority. Now, some of that's inbuilt, and some of that's because people also deal with the local authority for housing and for, you know, for rental allowances. It's kind of a transactional. But I'm really interested in all my different spheres of life is when you place something, when you kind of go, okay, there's a transactional relationship that we could possibly have here. We could possibly do business. We could possibly, you know, and that can go from me hiring an artist to planning a show to talking to a local resident. But let's park that. So we can go back to that. But let's have a conversation based upon what you're into. And I think it might sound very fluffy, but my God, what that can bring back to the transactional place is extraordinary. Because then you're bringing back a full person, or not full person, but like a partial, more engaged person than somebody who wants to tick a box. And I think I would agree completely with what kind of Frank was saying. That's more and more starting to happen organically, in local authorities and in, you know, policy making areas of government. But I think that to me is a culture. So that's culture for me is not about necessarily what goes on the stage. That should be a defined culture. Therefore, that is a defined culture of collaboration. Because once you start doing that, once you push that ball over the hill, it's rolling. And that's very hard to stop. So once you start those small trigger things, it's like I remember listening to Helen speak at a theatre forum conference many years ago about the beginnings of trying to get, you know, the Sultan or the Elephant into London, and an awful lot of it began with very small conversations that suddenly and advocates and getting people who believe in what you're doing and let them have the conversation. So I suppose in the end, like everything else in society, an awful lot of the leadership that really works is the one that can lay down ego and power. So you kind of go, why are we having this conversation? Is it for me to win? Is it for Mark O'Brien to kind of go, I'm going to dominate this now and my idea is going to win? Or is it for Mark O'Brien to get out of the way and kind of going, give the space that I'm able to develop to somebody else, and that I can become a trust advocate? So if I'm bringing someone into a conversation, therefore the Axis brand makes you trust this conversation more, rather than someone just rocking up off the street. So I think there's an awful lot to do with power dynamics and ego as well. But I think seeing people as people, it sounds very trite or very simplistic, but I mean, I think that's the key to an awful lot of it.
Thank you, Mark. Helen, I'm going to go to yourself in a second. Just to remind our attendees that the Q&A function is open. I'm sure some of you are feeling that there should be questions that could be asked that haven't been asked, so feel free to put them in. Helen, you indicated you'd like to have come in and talk in perhaps response to what Mark was saying. I think yeah, perfect. Thanks, Helen. No, you're good.
Everything that Mark has just said is so completely right, that you're very often, when you're trying to make change happen, you're told to partner with institutions, which is obviously one way of doing it, and you might do that on a formal level, but the real thing is to make friends with the people inside those institutions if you're trying to negotiate any sort of change. And in my experience, people only say no to stuff because they're frightened of saying yes. that there's a personal anxiety. You know, everyone has skin in the game, and they're, you know, you may be asking. I'm reminded when we were doing the Sultan's Elephant, the piece started with a giant rocket crash landing into the ground, and the French, being French, didn't want to do that with a sort of theatrical effect of scenery and bits of canvas and that kind of thing. They wanted to dig a 6 by 2 by 4 meter hole in the ground, which, given everything else we were doing to ceremonial London, wasn't a very big deal. But I had to go to Westminster City Council and say, you know, oh, we've found this space and it's just outside the Athenaeum, it's in this quite posh square, and can we dig a hole in the ground? And they said, absolutely not. And I said, but why? And they said, well, you can do it theatrically, and you can, you know, you don't need to do this. And I said, but guys, you dig holes in the ground all the time for, you know, congestion charging masts and water leaking things and construction sites. And what we all know about a hole is that the hole gets filled in again and everything is back to normal. And they said, but this is the wrong sort of hole. And that was such an interesting conversation, because it was about anxiety. It was about, you know, we understand why we need to dig a hole when it's a water main or a gas leak or something. We don't understand why this is important, and therefore it's not important, and therefore I'm not going to say yes. So a lot of the negotiating that we do around the projects, and particularly that one and other things that we've done, is around taking away that moment where people are asking, why would I do this? And transforming that. There's always a moment of transformation which you can absolutely put your finger on, when they all start saying, why wouldn't I do this? Because and that why wouldn't I do this is about personal investment. It's about saying, I want my kids to see this, or this sounds really amazing, my community would be transformed in this way. So it's one of the techniques. It's now evolved as a technique, but it was only ever an instinct, which is just make friends. And as Mark says, park your don't go in there going, oh, we've done these great things before, you're going to love this. Recognize the equivalent center of self in other people, and recognize the anxieties that they also feel, and try and do it as a partnership. So the only final thing I'd say is that in Durham, after a few years, we were trying to get a huge tower crane into a very small space, and the crane came down a little lane to make an impossible right-hand turn, and we just couldn't get the crane in. And I phoned the head of the built environment at Durham County Council, a lovely man called Davy Wafer, who I remind about this conversation a lot. And I phoned him up and I said, hello, Davy, it's Helen. We're just doing this thing and I just need to knock a wall down. Is that okay? And he said, yes. And then he said, which wall? But he said them in that order. He said yes, because he knew I wouldn't be asking if I didn't need to. He trusted me. He knew it wasn't an ancient 14th century wall, part of Durham Cathedral. He just said yes. And then he said, which wall? So I think when you can get people to be your partners in the really real sense, your friends effectively, who want the thing to happen as much as you do, then you've got over a whole ton of hurdles. And the lovely thing that that Mark said about you know, a public official is a person too. I mean, they're a person first before they're a public official, and you have to find that place and understand what the anxieties are, and then try and, you know, deal with them together.
What strikes me though, and thank you for that input, Helen, what strikes me is, aside from having to be very creative and visionary, people need to have the capacity of building very good relationships, being superb communicators, because if you don't have those skills, you don't get past those conversations.
But, you know, everybody has friends. Most people have friends. You know, it's about, and it is about ego. It's about, you know, that there are moments, I know, where you have to sort of draw yourself up and go, you have to do this and you have to make that happen. But those are really, really rare when you're really back against the wall. Mostly the people you're negotiating with, in my experience, have better ideas as to how to solve the problems than you do. Because it's, you know, if I'm talking to the bridge engineers in County Durham and I want to put a 70-foot structure on a 14th century bridge, they're going to know about the engineering better than I am. And I have to respect that expertise and give them the opportunity to contribute their knowledge, and not go in there, you know, arsey kind of going, I know what I'm doing. which I have done in the past, but I'm wiser now. You have to that phrase. It's a phrase from Middlemarch, actually, George Eliot, the equivalent centre of self. I think it's really important that you recognise other people living in the centre of their own lives.
Thank you, Helen. Dermot, I'd like to bring you in because, again, I've heard you speak around community participation, around, in particular, the design of buildings, the public realm. Would you be able to explain a little bit more about how this works and what it goes through? And before you do, for those who are asking questions, there is 3 dots on the right-hand corner. If you want to click that, that'll bring you in. So, Dermot, on that, and if you'd like to develop on that experience.
Yeah. It's really interesting listening. I'm tempted to challenge here a bit on Helen's point. So I'm not tempted, I am going to challenge. I think it is important, as Mark says and Helen has affirmed, that we look at people first, absolutely. But also in shaping the way we do things, I think we need to unpack what's going on there. So one is the trust word seems to be really key. And a proxy for trust in public discourse sometimes is policy and assurance, boring stuff. But we need trust. So your relational point there, Owen, I think is really important. So that trust is important because maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but down the road, something will happen and somebody wants to know that the things needed is there. So there's a whole bunch of people looking at things and we need to build trust that those things are there. So the trust bit for me is really important. Relationships work, friendship works, but there's something beyond that works. So, and I think this links into the public realm and participation bit, because for some people, their key concern is the thing I need when I need it needs to be there. I don't want to have a big conversation on it tomorrow when I need an ambulance. I need an ambulance tomorrow. So there's bits there. So I think there's one bit around support for people, if you like, long-term bit, ongoing bit. So there's that kind of trust side. I think a second side of that, which is coming into mind, is that a problem with building discussions is people focus on buildings. Funny that. And actually, the bigger issue is what's it for? What are the activities for which we need the building? So sometimes we gear the conversation on, do you like this building or that one? Or do you like this color or that one? You kind of go, that's an important set of discussion. But a more important thing is, what is it we need the buildings for? And I think this kind of, for me, just reflecting on Helen and Mark's thing, I think there is a problem in the way we organise services and societies. We separate stuff. So you go to the Garda for Garda stuff. You go to the hospital for a spare leg. You go to the social worker for whatever. It's all kind of separated. And that's the opposite of your relational point, because it's highly transactional. So if we were able to kind of blend those experiences different, if we were able to kind of blend the services different, so that the Garda station is not just the Garda station, it's actually a hub for people, the health centre, and do that by not building a new building, by actually changing the relationships, changing the spaces, and changing the way things work. So bringing it back, I think one of the problems on the discussion on built environment is we go to talk about stuff first. We need to talk about meaning and purpose first. Then we need to look out the door at what we already have and say, can we remake all the stuff we already have to do that? And I guess around that, we need to make sure there's an architecture of trust so that on the day that you need it, it's there. So I suppose I'm answering your question in a number of ways. There's a long-term thing where, whether it's projects or policies, we need trust and assurance. There's a midterm thing where I think we need to reorganize how we're doing things, because we're designing the world to separate. We need to blend it. And a short-term thing, actually, to some of the discussion here, is that some of the active street stuff that we're going gives a picture of what different could look like. Do more of that to drive into the second bit, which is around reorganizing things, and then get into the third.
And Dermot, that's superb. But can I then push back? Are there practical things that then can happen within Sligo, for example, from your perspective, to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Sligo is interesting, in, and been very, very successful in the recent 48 million euro investment in the town centre. Huge, and kudos to everybody in the community doing it. and it's going to have a library, it's going to have a facility for the college, and it's going to have housing, and that's great. But it will be interesting to see how much more can we do? How can we push that even further? So with the same building blocks, how might you connect in more of the social justice bit? How might you connect in more of the arts bit? So it's not a library. That same building facility is able to host a lot more. Now that you have the money in the bank, reimagine what you could do with that investment. So that's kind of one side of it. I think the second side is when you look around the town, there's lots and lots and lots of spaces, some used, some not, and there's lots and lots of services, some used, some not. How would we reorganize the jigsaw of what's happening in the town, you know, by just getting partnership discussion to go, the kind of thing that Mark's talked about? So on your 48 million, how do you get more out of it? And on the money you don't have, how do you get more partnerships to connect up more often?
Thank you, Dermot. Gillian, can I go to you? Because I said in your introduction that central to your own kind of mission or approach is nurturing streets as places. When you hear Dermot, when you hear the conversation, what's your reaction from a living in Sligo perspective?
That's great. The allocation of the funds has just been an immense win for the town, and the team who were behind it did amazing work, and I'd like to thank them for that. And this is a real opportunity, really, to as Dermot touched on there, just to reimagine these spaces, the space between the buildings. I mean, the buildings our built heritage is beautiful. It's small, it's compact. A lot of it is in bad repair, so we think we need to go on around that. But I suppose as regards the existing infrastructure, is a lot of empty buildings and buildings that aren't being used, similar to an awful lot of small towns across Ireland, and indeed the world now. It's becoming a bit of an issue. Yes, but I would like to see partnerships growing between the community and the business owners, the building owners, and to have some of this funding that's allocated to the town for basically takeovers, or for temporary takeovers of these buildings as creative spaces for artists to come down from the hills. Sligo is full of creative people, and the hinterland. To bring them into town, to create together, to get together. This is a really unique opportunity that we have to have this funding. And it was a point I was going to come to, all right, was just to be assured that a good amount of it is allocated. I'm not sure about the percentages, but that some would be allocated to the arts programs, but and also to people-centered programs within the community. So that's the built infrastructure, but then there's a space between the buildings, of course. A lot of them are, when we're reimagining Sligo town, a lot of those places are forgotten. You know, it could just be a laneway that has a ton of cars parked down the end of it, or whatever. These are unique little, precious little spaces in the town that would could easily be transformed into small parks, little place for people to sit and have their lunch, or a bike park, or somewhere to have bicycles repaired. It's great infrastructure now in Sligo for bicycles. We're creating a lot more cycle paths, encouraging people to be more active. So yeah, I think this funding is a really unique opportunity for us to really nurture the streets as places, to try stuff, as Jens was saying yesterday, the power of doing. You know, there's no point in having all these ideas and all these creative people and all these various stakeholders and people within the community who would love to spend more time together, or be able to kick a ball around the town, you know, or, you know, play on a swing, or sit down on a bench and talk to an old person who you just don't see about the place because it's so unwelcoming. It's really just to start small interventions, start small, garner trust, and then once you're, you know, to do often and do small, and then learn and gain people's trust, and then we'll have Helen in a couple of years, and she'll do.
Well, thank you, Gillian. Frank, can I go to you? Mark made the wild assertion a little while ago that people working in a local authority are actually people. So given that you're working in a local authority, I'm presuming that you yourself are a person, but there are a couple of questions that have come in that I think are probably interesting from your own perspective. That in reimagining, what part, and this comes from Cliff Haig, who'll be speaking this afternoon, what part does legacy or the threat of COVID, including lost jobs or more poverty, how does that play into defining your thinking going into the future?
Well, I suppose I'll go back to the point about reimagining our town, especially in the context that it threats it's facing associated with, let's say, COVID-19 and, let's say, the hollowing out of our core and changing retail patterns associated with increased online retailing. I suppose it's only quite recently that there's been a shift away from designing our cities around getting as many cars as possible in through the city. And that tradition in Sligo has manifested itself strongly in relation to people trying to park their car as close as possible to the shop they're trying to visit. So that cultural shift away from car-dominated town centre has come about because of the realisation that the car tends to be stuck in traffic, takes up valuable road space, generates air and noise pollution, and is pretty unhealthy for the person behind the wheel. So I suppose one of the guiding principles of the work we're doing in the public realm plan is about designing spaces and streets for people, not cars, thereby turning physical infrastructure in the city core, like roads and car parks, into social infrastructure of streets and public spaces. And I think that's one of the positive things that has come out of the pandemic is there's an increasing appreciation of our public spaces around our town centres. And you can see that in terms of taking streets back, both in terms of cycleways, but also in terms of improving pedestrian movement across our town, and that's in terms of the recent announcement. There was two elements to that announcement. One of which was in relation to delivering our ongoing work on the implementation of that public realm plan to the tune of about 19 million, and a lot of that is to do with turning some of our surface car parks into proper public spaces where people can gather and organize different events.
Thank you, Frank. A question has come in, and Natalie, I'd like to bring you in on it, guys. And just to be a little dogmatic, if we could keep the questions or your answers to the questions on the short side, because I'm keen to get recommendations and takeaways from you. So I want to leave a little bit of time. But Natalie, a question has come in around asking for good advice or examples of consulting with communities or developing relationships in the pandemic environment. You might take that one if you could, and perhaps you might even want to tell us about the new European backhouse that you're involved in as well.
Yeah, I'll tell you just a bit about the new European backhouse. It's our involvement. Is it? Am I off mic? Yeah, I am. Sorry. Yeah. I usually it's something that was set up by the EU, and it's more of an ideas thing at the moment. And all we're doing, we're just working with the collaboration with the Design and Crafts Council and with the Irish Designers Institute of Designers of Ireland, just to get people out there engaging in it and making submitting ideas to the Bauhaus website. I think it's a co-design process from their perspective. We're just the messengers. We're just trying to get Ireland engaged in participating in this new idea, which is crucially, I mean, it's set up. It's literally looking at the spirit of the Bauhaus and how they believe that everyone, a society is where everyone has access to, and not just the utilitarian aspects of society, but also the pleasures and beauties of living. So it's kind of that idea, and they're using it as a kind of a framework to discuss the recuperation of society, or everything that we're talking about here today, but also crucially as part of their new European Green Deal, and climate change is crucially important to all of that. So that's just something for everyone to do themselves. But what was the other question again? Sorry,
any quick advice on consultation in the pandemic?
Yeah, I would advise people who would like to know more about how to think about their built environment in terms of the impact the pandemic is having on them and their communities. If they contact the Irish Architecture Foundation, and particularly our Reimagine programme, we have, and I keep on talking about the IF, but we're just a collective, it's absolutely not just me. We have that programme which is called Reimagine, which is funded by Creative Ireland and the Arts Council and the Department of Housing, Heritage and Local Authority. But we have a team and a group of people there that are willing to help. And one thing that Ireland is full of is underutilised, unbelievably creative people in the design community. Completely underutilised, as in there are so amazing, great talented people who come out of architecture school who spend most of their time just designing extensions of back gardens. These people are ready. Yes. Are ready to be used and utilised at this time. So quickly, just ask people if they just contact the Reimagine or the Irish Architecture Foundation, and our details are totally Googleable. So that's a quick answer.
Thanks, Natalie. While you have the floor, are there any key takeaways or recommendations that you would give the people watching and the people of Sligo?
Okay, I would. Okay, I've scribbled lots of things here, and I have to make sense of them now. What I take away from this conversation, actually, and it's from everybody's input, which has been unbelievably valuable, and I've learned so much from it as well, is I say that city and towns are integrated systems. They have their own logic and dynamism, and which would change over time and should be allowed change over time, and policy should not just reflect this, but consider this. Other things, that participation practice benefits everybody and everybody learns. That's the power of reciprocity. What else? God, I've lost.
No, they were perfect, Natalie. No. Thanks a million. Was there any?
I have more. But anyway, I don't know.
Perfect. Frank, I'll bring yourself in there. Thanks.
Just come back to the point, I think somebody might have raised it in a question as well about public officials. And I think as public officials we have to get away from this perception of control, and that sometimes as planners or urban designers we kind of have to get out of the way and let the community or people who are going to use the space design that space, or that spaces should evolve kind of organically. And that might enhance the richness of those spaces.
Thank you, Frank. Gillian?
I would just like to encourage members of the public, the creative community in Sligo, which is vast. So that's the two groups, the community and the creatives outside of that, and part of that, to be brave, to gather together, to communicate between each other, with each other, and to think about what's important and how we can reimagine the streets as places you want to be and hang out and create and make and chat and learn from each other, and then build it, create it, and they will come. We will have visitors, and our lives will be much enriched. And then on the side of the council, county council, to say thank you very much for your support so far, and the great work you do, but to as reiterated Frank is saying, just sort of open up a little, relax, trust, and together I think between the people, the creatives, and the council and local government, we can really make great changes and for the better for Sligo. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks, Gillian. Dermot?
Thanks, Owen. So for me, I think it would be really amazing if Sligo built on the invitation to conversation to kind of create Ireland's first common city. So building on the discussions yesterday, a different type of public space, which is conversation driven, which blends the citizens, the public, and the bits. I think that could have three components. So a co-creating city, a kind of different way of governance, a different way of looking at it. The three components are systemic conversations. Second, scale up the anchor collaborations that COVID has delivered and support that. And the third is to build safe space for challenge. So that this is a different type of model of how places work. Common city, built on yesterday, space for conversation, space for collaboration, and space for challenge.
Brilliant, Dermot. Thank you very, very much. Mark?
Sorry, I just lost where the unmute button was. Just four very quick things. They're sentences. As people moving towards conversations, which are kind of key, I kind of ask people to always think of what's the worst that can happen. Just have that thought in your head, but then follow that up quickly with what's the best that can happen. Particularly people who are making it the approach where it comes from one side or the other, don't have the other person's no in your head when you enter a conversation. Like someone will say no to you if they want to say no. Don't go into the conversation expecting a no, because then you'll more than likely get it. And also, just to finish for me on a metaphor, well, not a metaphor, an analogy really. I remember years and years and years ago, I was asked to host a conversation around childcare workers and artists and what was needed on both sides of it. And it was done over the course of a day, and the room was full of childcare workers and full of artists and a few arts organisations. And in the afternoon, the childcare workers were asked what they needed, and they wanted to meet more and learn from more artists. And the artists were asked what they were needed, and they wanted to meet and learn from more childcare workers. And I went, well, there you are. So I think sometimes we try and make complex things, or sorry, we try and make simple things complex in order to validate the importance of our roles. Whereas actually, it's just about bringing people together in a trusting environment and let them have the conversation first.
Thank you, Mark. Natalie, I'm going to bring you back in a little while. I'll go back to Helen now, if I may. Helen, are there any key takeaways, key recommendations, key insights from the great work that you have done through your career?
I think more valuable are the insights from this conversation, I think, which has been so interesting. I'm nervous about one thing. Can I say that? When we said don't ask someone a question if you're not interested in their answer, I'm nervous that there are all these questions in the Q&A that we haven't answered. I think that might be considered to be a bit rude.
We've a bit of wiggle room at the end, so we should be okay.
But you know, I think the thing that Mark said that really struck me was it's like putting food dye into water. I suddenly had this really vivid image of a jar of water that is transparent, and then suddenly it's purple, and it's purple because it's purple. And that sense that, you know, that towns and public spaces, so the spaces between buildings, these are our places, you know, it's ours. It doesn't belong to someone else who gets to say what it should or shouldn't be like, although that seems to be the, you know, the measure of control with which we live. And therefore, I guess that sense of, you know, active humanity being part of the conversation, whether that's that people have to be sought out, that somebody said, you took the trouble to come and see me, whether that's that one has a responsibility to go and find people and solicit opinion and need and desire, or whether actually people need to be encouraged to be more active, to have a view, to have a sense that the built environment in which they exist doesn't belong to someone else, it belongs to them, and that we can change it as we wish.
Super, Helen. Thank you very much. Natalie, were there one or two other takeaways? I also have a question that I'll put to you that has come in through the Q&A function. But for example, yeah, go on.
Actually, there was one takeaway that I've now just read the questions that's similar to one of these questions. Coincidentally enough, I think it was the one about local authorities, COVID-19, public spaces.
Yes.
Were you going to ask me that one?
That's the one I was going to ask you. So if you want to have a rattle at that.
Okay, I was just going to say one of the key things for this, I mean, it's a great opportunity that there is this capital scheme, and one of the key things and the most important things is, like, please don't just, when you're thinking of putting objects in the public arena, think about buying things out of catalogues. Please consult with a spatial designer or that type of thing, because if to answer these questions about the project, that's the one thing, that one priority I would say, in order to answer all these questions that Rona has put into her question. You know, when she's talking about the challenges associated with COVID-19 to support the recovery, creative entertainment industries, the first thing is to just engage with an architect who can talk, or a spatial designer, or a landscape architect indeed, of course, who can talk you through what is best needed to get the most out of that in terms of adaptability and future use and future proofing. Can I just, there's another question there. Oh, sorry, there's just another question there on climate change, and where do you think we need to be focusing our strategies and energies in terms of climate change? And I think actually one of the key things about buildings, and it connects to what Dermot was saying, the reuse of buildings is just one thing we should be doing. It's something that people, when they think climate change, might not think about, but the reusing of buildings is a key thing that will help us reach that target.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Dermot, those two questions to yourself in relation to the question from Rona, which is around the reacting to COVID-19 and supporting the recovery through creative and cultural and entertainment events, as well as then that element on climate change, for example. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so on climate change, I think it is about repurposing, and it builds on Gillian's point around how can we rethink what we already have. And I think that is a really important element, because the decision to build means we surge a lot of resources into a new thing, and we haven't answered the question of what do we do with the things we already have and the needs we already have. So I think that's number one on climate change. And actually that links into the heritage and the potential for culture. So how do we aggressively reimagine what we have to be something really new and amazing? And then on the COVID side, for me, I think it's important to validate the huge effort that community individuals, community groups have done in shielding, in supporting prescriptions, and kind of just looking out for people. Some of those are organized, some of those are spontaneous, but there's a massive amount of collaborative energy happening. And the risk, I think, is that we come out of COVID and go, oh, thank God that's all over. Let's all go back now. So I think there's something around naming it, validating it, capturing it, and then creating a platform for people to be able to move on. And that seems to be essential to tackle some of what Cliff rightly talked about. There's job losses happened and happening. So resilience, well-being, support, relationships are going to be essential for people as we move on. So where people are say, this is a tough time, but thank God I'm able to talk to this person, and I can have a bit of space and I can sort myself out. So validate what's happened, create a platform for it to move on. And actually that links to your climate change bit, because you go, where would we do that? You kind of go, let's use the spaces we already have.
Superb, Dermot. The final question is going to go to yourself, Mark. And in fact, it was the first question that came in. And it is from Ronan Gilroy that says, this is a complex topic and many of Sligo's key decision makers are absent from the conversation. How do you avoid the, quote, culture lost in this translation? And how do we know that they appreciate the points that we're discussing?
I think there could be a mechanism kind of after. I mean, I know the conference is going to remain up online and recorded, but it's also a very simple way of doing that, rather than doing it in an adversarial way, going, why weren't you at that? You were supposed to be at that. You should have been at that. Because people have busy lives, and a city manager or a senior manager in the local authority may not have had the time to be here. So I suppose it's actually finding a mechanism to bring, did you hear this question that was raised? Did you hear this idea that was done? What would you think about that? So I think the tone of the approach is key, because if you go in with an adversarial, all Sligo County councillors should have been at this meeting. Well, they're not. All the arts sectors not at the meeting either. So I think there's no hierarchy in availability, and sometimes people in, say, the wider cultural sector view themselves as the font of all availability, and they're right. Well, actually, maybe we're not. Maybe it's our job now to kind of bring these conversations to a different paradigm. But I think that my take from that would be to not be adversarial at all.
And to remember that they're people.
Well, yeah.
That's a great takeaway and a great way to finish this off. And on behalf of all of the people watching this, can I thank all of the people who were part of this conversation. It was fascinating, great to hear the stories, the insights, certainly the advice and guidance. It was really marvelous. So on behalf of everybody watching, can I thank Helen, Natalie, Mark, Jermid, Gillian, and Frank for their wonderful contributions. Guramila Mahagwev, it is very much appreciated.